Welcome to Journey to C-Suite, bringing diversity to the top. This event right now is the place to be if you're looking for actionable steps to accelerate your path to senior executive leadership. As I mentioned earlier, this is our third session of the series, following our gatherings in Vancouver and New York. We have one more session to go after today. It's taking place in Toronto. So if you are tuning in from Toronto, please join us in person on June 8th. The registration is available on our website. First and foremost, we want to thank our partners at Indeed.com who helped us make this event possible. Journey to C-Suite, presented by Indeed.com, was brought to you by WNORTH. WNORTH is a navigational membership for women on a trajectory toward senior executive leadership. We offer programs and services focused on bringing you the tools and resources that you need to succeed in your career, from peer mentorship programs, access to career coaches, educational content led by industry experts, roundtable discussions, and networking events designed to keep you connected and thriving. For more information, please visit our website. So, what can you expect today? This event has two parts. The first one, that's taking place right now, focuses on our panel and will last for 1 hour. This is an interactive session, and you are welcome to drop in your questions in the chat. You can either click on the button Join the Conversation and introduce yourself, or use the applause button for reactions. After our panel, we invite all of our guests to join us for the second part of the event, a meeting where we can all continue the conversation, share our favorite takeaways, talk a little bit more with our speakers, and also look into strategies how to bring more diversity to the top. So, how does the journey to C-Suite look like for us today? What are the real life experiences? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? I am looking forward very much so to learning this with you from our speakers today. And now it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. So let's start with Bahar. Hi, Bahar.
Everyone.
Bahar is our city director in Montreal, and she's also the director at PwC, Canada's Advanced Analytics and AI practice. Prior to PwC, Bahar was a tech entrepreneur and created an AI-powered virtual research assistant and automatic knowledge discovery tools in computer science and biomedical domains. Nowadays, she also mentors several AI startups, and recently she was recognized as a woman in AI to watch by Forbes. Hi again, Bahar. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, next up. Next up, we have Misty Geither. Misty is Indeed's Vice President of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. At Indeed, Misty is focused on setting the global strategy to ensure the company is designing equitable systems and processes that contribute to a sustainable culture of inclusion and belonging. Misty is a natural connector and relationship builder. She's also used to being one of the only in the room, and she uses it as her superpower. Nice to have you here, Misty.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
And next one, we have Smitha Reddy, US Brand Chair and Global Client Leader at Edelman. Smitha leads a team of 250 plus employees around the world. Passion areas include mentoring and supporting a professional development of staff while helping to drive new business growth for the firm. She was recently named PR Week's 40 Under 40 and is on the leadership board for the Global Women's Equality Network. Nice to have you.
Thank you so much. Excited to be here today. Hi, everyone.
And last but not least, we have Shilpa Tiwari, founder of Her Climb, a social enterprise with a mission to increase the participation of women of color in senior and executive positions in corporations and organizations across Canada. Prior to Her Climb, Shilpa held a position of the Global Executive Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability at Citizen Relations. So, those are all of the introductions. And now, without any further ado, let me pass the word over to our panel moderator, Bahar, so she can get us started on the conversation you all came here for.
Well, thank you so much, Eva. I just want to start off by saying it is an absolute pleasure for me to be the moderator of this panel. It is an honor to be among you amazing ladies on this call, and I hope during our time together on this panel, we'll get a little bit more in terms of your personal stories, your journey to today, and kind of some of the lessons learned that you have that you think are helpful and impactful, so that we share with the broader audience. As I said, I think it would make sense for us to get to know each other a little bit. So, in terms of your personal stories, maybe I'll start with Misty first, just because you're on top of my screen. I kind of wanted to know, when you reflect on your journey and the experiences that you had in your workplace that actually shape your professional journey, can you tell us a little bit about how you got here? And perhaps you can elaborate a little bit more on if you ever faced some kind of an unjust biases or any challenges that you faced along the way, and then you can tell us what's your superpower and your secret to overcome them.
Sure. Happy to share briefly. When I reflected on the question, it actually took me back to how I even arrived at the position I'm in today. And so my career has been nothing but like very unconventional, non-linear, cross industry. And I absolutely love how all of those experiences shape how I approach the work that I do today. And so when you think back to like how you even decide on what you want to be when you grow up, the question we always ask people, like, I thought I was going to be a doctor, a pediatrician to be exact. I went to a medical magnet high school, volunteered at a trauma center in Los Angeles, and then I learned like I probably should not be a doctor. Flat out not my thing. And so then I considered hospital administration, because that's what one of my uncles was doing. And then I found out about this amazing business school. I'm super proud of my alma mater. It is a historically Black college and university, Florida A&M. And so I went to the business school, and then fast forward, coming out of school, I started my career in consumer packaged goods. I worked for Big Tobacco. Not going to go deep down that path, but ultimately a lot of autonomy very early on in a sales organization, and worked across multiple markets. And if you know anything about Big Tobacco or consumer packaged goods, you can probably guess the demographic composition of all the folks at the top. And if you think about Virginia or New York back in the early 2000s, late 90s. And so in that experience, I was like always like the one that they would ask to go and do something and represent the company for something diversity related. And it was very different than, diversity today. It wasn't even called diversity. It was more still talking along the lines of affirmative action, if you will, if it was even said at all. And so as I reflect on that, now I know that it was actually more like tokenism, or it wasn't like a healthy way to be used and represent the company, because it was quite performative. So I stayed with the company for about 7 years, and then I moved into retail financial banking, worked for JP Morgan Chase for a while on both the retail side and the business side. And again, I'm always being tapped to do something. And I'm like, what is it? And then I think one thing that was like striking in terms of personal story and experience, because there were so few Black women that were in the role or at the firm in this particular region, people would see me and they would call me like, oh, you're Lysandra. I am 5 foot tall. Lysandra is like 6 feet. I'm like, there's no way we're the same person. But for any of us that have been mistaken for someone else because there's so few, we understand where that comes from. And so then, because I am now based in San Francisco Bay Area, when I was a business banker, I started to see a lot of the venture capital firms buying up companies in my portfolio, large money movement transactions. And I'm like, I have to figure out how to get into that industry. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And so I started researching a company called Code 2040. It is a nonprofit, it's tech adjacent, and they focus specifically on racial equity and inclusion, specifically for the Black and Latin populations and technologists. And so after literally 2 years of following them, I wrapped up my career at the bank and landed a role building out their revenue generation strategy and leading their business development efforts. And so it was then, and that was something that was really pivotal, right? And when I saw my career really take a turn. So I've been fortunate to work for leaders who saw something in me, took a risk. If I take a step back, even at the bank, I had no banking experience. I just remember going with my grandmother, like did not like to run that errand. It always took forever. And they're like, oh, you can be a branch manager. And the person that I was working for, he was a Black man, had been with the firm in New York and had moved out west. He gave me an opportunity to build an entire team, build an entire business from zero. And so it's those moments when people start to see you and they see the opportunity and they take the risk on you as a woman, on you as a woman of color, specifically as a Black woman, in the same way the majority populations get that experience all the time. And so I'll wrap up really quickly here. And so, but that was kind of like the catalyst for those other experiences that I started to really recognize. And so it wasn't until I started working for, honestly, people of color, minority leaders, where I saw a big switch that was like career changing. So when I worked at Code 2040, I was directly with the CEO, and people often requested her to obviously show up at events. And she's like, but really, this is your job to cultivate the relationship, identify if there can be investors, et cetera. So you go. So there was this inherent trust and confidence in my ability, space to learn and grow that you don't always get when you are kind of on the periphery or you're the minority, or there's this undertone of, oh, you're here because we had to hold this space for you. And thankfully, I've continued to have opportunities to work for women. I'm fortunate to work for LaFawn Davis. You can Google her. She's amazing. I've worked for her now at 2 organizations, and the same continues to be true. And so, that has really shaped, how I approach my work in this diversity space and the things I continue to do to advocate for folks that are coming behind me.
That's wonderful. And it certainly underlines the importance of having allies and people who are available to you, accessible to you, that think like you. And it's a pivotal point when we actually find someone that actually cares and thinks alongside us. And that has been, I think, a repeating theme to many of us whose journey actually was impacted by people who offered hand holding in the beginning, and they were actually really our allies. And it doesn't matter if they're women or men, we can find allyship in everywhere, right? So that is certainly something that resonates with us as well. Moving over to Shilpa, when you reflect on your journey, how does that compare with Misty? Because we've also learned about Misty's, going from one place to another and actually make a change, and being brave enough to acknowledge that maybe this is not for me, or maybe I'm going to go to my next level, or if you don't like something, do something about it, right? Does that talk to your experience? We're wondering to know about that.
Yeah, no, surprisingly, like Misty, I didn't have a conventional path. And for outsiders, they may think of it as difficult to understand, but I was quite strategic. It just doesn't maybe seem so. I've always worked in the sustainability social impact field. I grew up with 2 parents from India, South Asian. So there was that element as well in terms of what I saw my world could look like, which was primarily be a doctor, which was not something I wanted to be. And I knew very early I didn't want to be. So I had to think about, and still my world in terms of what I could be was still quite limited. I started in the sciences because I didn't want to be a doctor, but it was like something that made everyone happy. But then decided to focus on the environment because I was also naturally quite outdoorsy. And it's interesting. I think as women of color, and Misty, you mentioned this in one of our calls, like it's important to recognize that we're not one group. We're highly diverse, even within beings of Indian origin. Within that, it's highly diverse as well. And so for me, growing up, because I like the outdoors within the South Asian community, I had a hard time fitting in because I was told you're not like other Indian girls. Because I was outspoken, I was athletic, I liked to hiking in Nepal, hiking in Tanzania. but that also, my career was then focused more on sustainability, and I moved to different industries. I started with the Canadian government, then moved to a think tank, and realized I needed to work abroad more because the world was global, even though at that time we still, we used email, but we weren't so advanced in technology the way we are. But I had a sense that we were going to be a highly networked world, and I needed to have a bigger sense of what the world looked like. Also, that South Asian in me, and maybe also being a woman, I felt I needed to have a whole slew of credentials. So I also ensured I had all of the academic credentials I needed, which I realized I didn't necessarily need to have. I see a lot of people doing what I do without a PhD. And for me, that was more this kind of growing up. My parents always felt if you had all the academic credentials, no one could take those away from you. That was something that justified you being in the room. But as I moved in into the professional sort of world, I realized people will find ways to minimize that, even though you're very proud of that. I found sometimes I would apply to a job and I was too qualified because I had a PhD, or I didn't have a PhD. There was always a reason why I either had too much or not enough. And getting back to my journey, I moved into consulting, which was deliberate after doing my PhD, because I thought it was important to get a really wide and deep knowledge in a variety of different industries in sustainability, because this field was evolving and I was going to grow with the field. And at that time, we didn't talk about EDI. And now EDI has also become, or equity, diversity, inclusion has also become a part of an expertise I have. So I was able to evolve as that world was evolving. And then moved into the corporate world. So I worked at a pension fund as their VP of sustainability, and then at a large global insurance company, again, as their VP of sustainability, because I wanted to bring that ability to connect the dots into a corporation, because they had capital and they could use that money and invest that money in interesting ways if they had someone to help them see that. But I realized that being a woman of color in a very white, men and women, in Canada it's men and women, was going to not be easy. And this is where I think a lot of racialized women really lean into their ability to navigate in a very different way environments, because we've had to. It's been a way that we survive. We see things, I think, with different layers. Because my skills really, I've always depended on my soft skills to move as in my career. It has, in which I think no longer are soft skills. Like, I think they're essential skills and far more vital than what we consider technical skills. And so my ability to influence and move people towards a specific goal, which I was able to learn working all over the world, was to be able to work across a diverse group of stakeholders, communicate priorities in a way that was consistent, and then move them forward. So in my career, while I've worked in different sectors and different types of organizations, the skill I've tried to really hone throughout was my ability to influence, inspire, motivate, and connect dots very quickly. Unlike Misty, I've never had the privilege of working with someone from a racialized or Indigenous background as a boss. And I think that's what's made, I feel my career journey has not, I don't think anyone's career journey is easy or easier, but it's been different. And I've always been in rooms where I'm the only, and I've made it deliberate. I'm making, particularly now, deliberate effort to be one of many, because I don't think we're going to change anything as the only. And so some of what Misty has been able to has been able to benefit by, is it Misty, the lady you mentioned that you, Lasonda? I'm sorry.
LaFawn Davis.
LaFawn, is that correct? LaFawn? So I'm hoping to create that kind of environment for others. I haven't been able to meet a lot of women executives of color that I've been able to work under and grow, and I really wish I had, because I think it would make a big difference. The other thing is that I'd like, and I don't know if we want to unpack this, but I'd love to get Smita and Misty's thoughts on this at some point, is I've always also in my career been the only executive in a room of predominantly white women and men, but I've built diverse teams. It's just that sometimes my teams, they have this expectation, rightfully so, in terms of equity, diversity, inclusion. And I want to ensure that moves forward, but they don't often see that I'm pushing against a system that doesn't look like me. So they have me, but I don't necessarily have someone. And I've been able to talk to my teams about that so that they can understand some of the challenges I face as a leader, and they can set their expectations around that. But I'd love to understand that more as a woman who very rarely is pushing. I'm pushing against the larger system, and I don't have the group around me to support that because I'm always the only executive of color in the room.
Yeah, certainly. We'll put a pin on that, and we'll definitely get back to that because I think that's also a very, very impactful story to share. I also want to make sure that I also give Smitha a chance to share her story with us. I know that Misty and Shilpa's journey were quite non-linear, right? There were a lot of changes, pivoting a lot. How does that compare to yours?
Yeah, and first of all, thank you so much for like leaving space for this conversation. So I'm really excited to be here today. And there's a lot of like similarities when I hear Misty and Shilpa share their stories, and a lot of like differences, right? And I look at someone like Shilpa, we probably have a lot of similarities in how we grew up, right? Both of my parents are also from India. My father is a doctor. But unlike Shilpa, I didn't think that I would ever get there, right? I didn't even feign that I would even go down that path. And so I was always a little bit of an oddball within my family. And that was always like a big sort of piece of struggle for me, is that I was the one who was like, well, I want to study journalism. I want to go into entertainment. And everyone looked at me like I was crazy, literally crazy. And I really resisted any sort of pressure that I had. And I sort of just realized like, I'm going to have to show them what this path looks like. And I'm going to have to be successful in what I want to do in order to be happy. And so I had some resistance in that path, but I think ultimately I got there. I think, my career has probably been a little bit more linear, but notwithstanding its challenges and pivotal moments that kind of took me from like maybe a path that gone like this way, but then took me in a different direction from a leadership perspective. I started out in the comms industry at a very large PR firm. I'm currently at the world's largest PR firm, Edelman. I look after our brand division in the US, but I'm also stepping into a new role, leading our global food and beverage practice for the company worldwide. And I think there have been pivotal moments for me where I've had to really break through and find different ways to connect and for my voice to be heard. My name is interesting, right? It's pronounced Smita, but it's actually pronounced Smitha. And I realized like that was a big challenge for me because I've done a lot of research around the power of your name. And I noticed that people were just either not saying my name in rooms or just butchering it and kind of bumbling through it. And it's like, okay, if people are not even afraid to say my name in a room or just not saying my name in the room, I'm not going to break through. So I remember like a few years ago, I actually like put a pronunciation guide on my signature, and like everyone sort of started to follow. And I was like, oh, okay, there's something here, right? In terms of like the power of our name and the power of our voices being heard. I have very large teams here at Edelman. And so it's very hard to reach out to everyone, but I think it's about creating that culture of inclusivity. I've had a lot of great allies here at Edelman, none that really looked exactly like me, but a lot of women of color. But honestly, I felt like the biggest unlock for me was when I asked for sponsors and mentors that didn't look like me, and particularly white men. And I think I had to really get there and ask for that feedback, because I was only really hearing from people who at least are women, right? And maybe they have a similar perspective than I do, and that's great. But I wanted to hear feedback from people who didn't look like me. So one of my biggest allies is Richard Edelman, and you know, he gives me feedback that I just hadn't necessarily thought about, you know, and I think he has a different life experience than I do, obviously. And I think that's actually been a real unlock for me. And I went through my career thinking like, okay, I got to find people who have similar paths to me. And I do. And I have a great sort of wide net of women leaders in the industry. We have like a secret society, you know, and that's amazing. And I go to them when times are tough. But I've really tried to push myself to get feedback and to have sponsors that didn't look like me, because I think that's also important to understand. I might not agree with the feedback or agree with what they said, but that's a perception of me that I want to make sure that I at least overcome and tackle. But yeah, I can talk a lot about, you know, different personality types. Like I, you know, grew up typically shy by nature. I am one who tends to listen more. And that is probably the antithesis of what we would think of someone in the communications field. But I really, like, I'm very proud of the fact that different types of personalities can succeed in this world. And you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room to get your message across. So excited to be here today for this.
That's awesome. And I think the recurring theme in everyone's journey, regardless of whether it was a linear, you know, within one company as you work your way towards a C-level position, or is it that you pivot from one to another to actually find your place? I think one recurring theme that we heard about was this concept of allyship. So we heard about Misty's experience. We heard about your relationship, so you can get feedback from someone who can, again, quote unquote, doesn't look like you. That's obviously very impactful. I want to go back to Misty. When you reflect on your experience, again, with Fonda and others, whether it's family, whether it's at business, right? Because that allyship can come from everywhere, and it can come from women and men around you. How would you, or how would you advocate, or how would you recommend that we actually go about this so that we ask for, or we can have more stakeholders being a little bit proactive to offer allyship? And what do you think the ultimate impact could be?
So, you know, I was having a conversation recently with a colleague. She happens to be a Latina woman. And we were talking about, you know, we continue to ask people like, help empower women and be allies and do all of the things. And I think we need to really understand that allyship is a verb, not a noun. And I think in the conversations lately around whatever you call it at your company, we call it DEIB here, and I added a plus symbol, or EDI. I think it is, Smitha is like really correct in the sense of it's asking for sponsorship, or not even asking for sponsorship, but it's empowering people who look like you, who are from the majority population, to actually do some of that work. And so, like, I'm in a really fortunate position. Like, I do not take it lightly that I have an amazing CEO, kind of like Smitha said, who is open, who's honest, like he gets it. And so in that case, it's like having him empower people in his sphere of influence to do the same is what we need. Like, we're already doing the work, right? By definition, empowerment is authority or power given to someone to do something. We have the title, we have the role, but we still face a lot of barriers, a lot of blockers, a lot of speed bumps. And so we need people to not just be an ally, but to be an accomplice, like truly do the hard work, say the hard things, and help your own people who are still creating the barriers get out of our way. Like, we actually don't need to be more stronger and more confident by definition of empowerment. I think I am pretty freaking awesome, and I still face the challenges. And so I think it is just having the space and opportunity to be like bold and be courageous. And I think it is acknowledging and actually thinking about the difference when you think about success and likability, and that correlation, and how it's negatively correlated for us as women and positively correlated for men. And so I think organizations can actually do a lot of, and I don't want to say training, people train, they forget. And so it's like the continuous education and learning. It's like the refreshes that our computers and our phones remind us to do. Otherwise, it gets overloaded and it slows down. I think it's that type of behavior that we need to see. And one of the focuses at Indeed is really thinking about policies and processes. We don't want to be like overly, policy heavy, but if you think about where the bias and the barriers exist, it's not in the human interaction day to day. The barriers are in the structures. And so I think that taking a step back and looking at some of those things that are historic in nature, if you have a very established organization, like an Edelman, like an Indeed, or even if you're at like a firm, like a financial firm, and really kind of going deeper to really uncover what can be done. And I think, Shilpa, you mentioned, I think in our prep call, segmentation of what's needed for us as women is super important. We need to think about women in the context of the LGBTQIA plus community. We need to think about women in terms of our racial, ethnic minority status, age, et cetera. That way we can really, really solve the problem. And so I think it's really getting down to like, what is the lowest common denominator that we need to solve for, and always like conditioning people to think about those who are on the margins. Because for all of the representation and progress, we still have to have our secret society. We still have to do a lot of work on our own that can easily be done if people that are, at the CEO level, the CFO level, the COO level are actually talking to their folks to really kind of take some of the burden off of us. So I just think about that differently. We still need allies, but we need more than allies at this point.
Exactly. And I think maybe it would be a little bit more value achieved from that allyship if you actually approach your sponsor or somebody who's supporting in your journey with perhaps questions or specific asks, or ask for guidance on something, right? Rather than just provide me with feedback. Wondering about your experience, Smitha. Can you give us an example of maybe some of the most impactful questions that you asked of your sponsors?
Yeah, I definitely was I was going through this period where, one of the things that I am really proud of, of my upbringing being first generation is like my work ethic, right? And some of the valuable lessons that both my parents passed down to me around working hard. And I think there's sometimes a difficult balance that you get into where you are working really hard, but maybe that work is not being seen, recognized, or it's having the impact that you want it to have, right? To break through. And I do think that's what separates leaders, right? Like it's not necessarily about always working hard. It's about working smart and focusing on the things that have the biggest impact, right? And so I remember asking a senior person at Edelman who did not look like me, saying, I'm kind of feeling like I'm working really hard right now, but I'm not making an impact. And they were really sort of suggesting to me that I needed to be more visible outside of the firm. And so I'd said, okay, great. Can you let me know of opportunities that come your way, or that you think that I should be reaching out for, or I should be doing? And they actually really took that very seriously. And I so appreciated it. And I think it was because I was specific versus saying like, can you help me figure out, why I'm not making impact? It led to a conversation about external visibility and, about, okay, well, if you see a panel opportunity, or if you see a opportunity for me to write a blog post about X, Y, and Z, can you put my name in for it? I really want to be considered for those opportunities. And then they knew exactly what to do. And so I guess my question, my feedback or push here is just to be really specific on the types of things that you want from sponsors and leaders, because I think you'll get to a faster result.
That does make sense. I want to change the conversation a little bit, and I want to see it from Shilpa's perspective. You talked about having your team and trying to advocate for this, and you're kind of shielding them, right? So in a sense that collectively you all will try to kind of propagate and have more of EDI, if you were to plan for this journey, how would you envision that you can identify barriers and symptoms and others that actually prevents or would hinder this journey? What are your plans? What are some examples of something that you would look for so that you can plan for it and mitigate it, or work on it as you lead your team?
Oh, I think that it's a great question, and I don't think there's one answer to that. I think that's it differs for everyone. I mean, just listening to Smita and Misty, I think one thing is learning to be more specific helps mitigate some of the risks, or not getting what you're looking for, or being dissatisfied with what you're experiencing. And I think, like, when I think of my teams, I think that's something that takes time to learn. And I wish there was more coaching available to people in general so they could learn, like, what does it mean to be specific? And then when I think just broadly in terms of some of the risks in terms of presenting, or it's hard. I mean, I think mitigating risks is I would like to look at how do you identify opportunities, right? As opposed to mitigating risks. So and I think one of them is by being very, very specific, as Smitha said. Second is, like, I actually had to look and seek for people that looked like me for feedback, because I was only getting feedback for people who didn't look like me, because I worked in industries that were predominantly white, and we have less diversity in corporations, I feel, in Canada. So I had to seek out to understand how women of color actually experienced me so I could support them better. And so for me, I think another way of understanding opportunity in terms of your career is seek out diverse points of view, people like you and people not like you. In some cases, it might be, like for me, much easier to get feedback from people who don't look like you. But I find that getting feedback from people who have similar experiences is also really helpful. The other I don't know if it connects specifically to this question. Part of what I was doing, and this connects to some of what Misty was saying, part of what I was doing when I was at Citizen, which is a part of a larger agency called Plus Company, is bringing CEOs together who were all primarily white, and asking them tough questions. And so we are, as Misty mentioned, we are incredible. We are empowered. We have a voice. It's getting that space to use that voice. And I think when you can find the spaces to use your voice, it's important to use those voices so you can identify those opportunities. It's hard still, because I think a lot of those, because we're talking about the journey of this to the C-suite. The C-suite, they don't understand how to be allies and accomplices. And so being specific, again, about what you need, and also creating a space where you can be very frank about them in terms of why they're not creating an environment that's more diverse. I'm trying to think of how to connect some of the dots between what Misty has said and what Smitha has said. I think anyone listening here should know that you are most likely very, very qualified. You are most likely pretty incredible already. Figure out through your allies, your sponsors and mentors, where there are opportunities for you to develop further, to navigate the environment you're in, and then find support either through coaching or to someone else to ask those specific questions or make those specific actions. Because I know for me, I'm this introvert extrovert. So if I was given the feedback, you need to be more visible, it's not easy for me to be more visible, right? I would need some support in being more visible. And so understanding that about me was really helpful. But I understood that through someone else's feedback, right? So I think understanding risks and identifying opportunities is by building a system around you of support that's a combination of allies, mentors, sponsors, friends, and people that you trust completely to help you move through those risks and leverage those opportunities.
It does make sense a lot. And I'm wondering if Misty can contribute to this as well. If we were to provide that safe environment and accessibility to others who can be our allies, who can share feedback with us, who can coach us through this journey. What's your vision on providing such an environment, especially for organizations that are medium to large size, right? So this one-on-one coaching might not actually be a reality for everyone, but if we were to put together a safe environment, what do you think are the components of such environment?
When I think about environments that are ready to have women and women of color move into leadership positions, I think it's understanding all of the behaviors and microaggressions that have gone unaddressed that create, barriers for success. And so I think about, when you are moving into that space, it is understanding that everyone's going to like literally look differently or come across differently, right? Like if I don't walk into a room like with a big smile on my face, that doesn't mean that I'm angry. Or if I am objective in my decision making, non-emotive, data driven, if I'm doing that, like that's what you want, so don't necessarily penalize me for it. I think there are a lot of assumptions that people make. So again, I think for me it goes back to just the continuous education to disrupt any type of views you have on women and women who are racial ethnic minorities in that space. And so really I think it takes a cultural shift, which starts at the top, where CEOs and their direct reports will have to commit to actually undoing and unlearning some of things that they've been conditioned to think about women who are also parents, women who are caregivers. And so it's less about a lot of the outward programming because we haven't touched on that. And I think we over index on putting women through programs. Like it's a yes and, because I think that leaders have to have some accountability for how they're also adjusting and transforming to create a space where women are heard. Like a couple of common things that I think happen is, the erasure of our contributions. And I'm sure we experience that on a regular basis. Like I just experienced it, candidly yesterday. It's like we offer up something, someone repeats it and uses it as their own contribution or attributes it to someone else. And it's not just men versus women, like we do it to one another. And minority women do it a lot to, majority women do it a lot to minority women. And I don't think they realize it. And so, creating a space of psychological safety, I always say, when we join, we know, Smitha, you mentioned this, right? You have to work hard. You have to be disciplined. We were conditioned that way, right? From an education perspective, you always have to be the best and the brightest because there's always a question mark in the back of people's minds. Should we be there? And so we can't change that question mark. That question has to be changed by someone who's in that, group, whatever it may be, in group, out group, able bodied, not, for it to be safe, right? And we have to have the same opportunities to actually experiment, A/B test, learn and grow, and not feel like one mistake is actually going to be career ending. Because if we're honest, I think we are surrounded sometimes by a lot of folks who are just mediocre. And like a lot of things and like mess a lot of things up. And then we get to come in and clean up the mess. And we're expected to do it. But it's like, hey, like, why do they get to create all these messes? And if I make one mistake, it didn't cost us a ton of money. It didn't damage our reputation. And we're okay. Like, why do I feel like it's career ending? And that's the psychological safety piece. But it is, people are always, I feel like, conditioned to look for why it won't work versus why it will. And if we take a step back, like out of our respective organizations and look at globally the impact that women have on the world. And, I think there was just this experiment, like with kids, like little girls and little boys, and how the young women are conditioned to just be more organized, be team players, be thoughtful. They had to cook for themselves. And the boys, it was like complete chaos, pure pandemonium. And then when you actually like fast forward that to how we show up in real life, we're doing all of the things, right? But we have to have people read the research, whether it is on your Instagram feed or Twitter, or if it's a Business Insider article, but just pay more attention to the evolution of women and actually give yourself permission to change your mind about the roles that we're supposed to be in so you can accept us and respect us when we're in the room as your peer or even as your boss. So I just think there's a lot of ongoing education and just like trusting the research and trusting what's happening in front of you.
Absolutely. Smith, at the top of the call, when we were going over your bio, something that caught my attention is that you lead a team of 250 plus around the globe, right? So that adds more layers to the situation. So if we were to design, again, a safe environment for people to be able to speak up, to really be visible, right? Be safe to experiment, be safe to make a mistake, to be safe to transparently communicate, and then through that learn and grow. How would you anticipate that for someone who is leading a large size team around the globe, where we're not going to be in the same room to see each other every day, or actually being able to see, again, examples of microaggressions and others, which could be a symptom?
Yeah, it's a great question, and like my team has actually gotten like much larger around the globe through this process. But I think this goes back to something that Misty said around creating space for a lot of different types of voices. And I think this is really important, especially as we're all sitting here in North America, and we think about different work styles across the globe, and we also are using English, right, dominantly, which might not be everyone's first language, right? So what I found is being really intentional matters. So that might be pre-reads, so that everyone can get up to speed on their own time and not have to hear someone, go off into an introduction about what this meeting is about. Maybe someone's talking really fast unintentionally. So you really want to make sure that you're getting everybody on the same playing field and level first, so they all have access to the same information. I use the chat function a lot, and I actually prefer it, especially when I'm doing a global conversation, because again, I'm putting everybody on the same playing field. We're not allowing space for just the loudest person to speak up. Granted, there's always going to be loud voices. That's just how it works in the business world, but trying to, again, even the playing field as much as I can. The other aspect is I also appreciate there are just people who learn differently or process information differently. So just allowing space from that. You might have to call on folks more intentionally if you're seeing someone who has a good point and you want their perspective in this call. I will, sort of say, okay, what do you think about it? Or put it in the chat. Does everyone agree with me? Does anyone disagree with me? Really asking and making yourself vulnerable for that space. And then finally, especially on global teams, we are so Western centric, you do the call at night, right? Let everyone do their call in the morning. We're typically we'll schedule them in the morning on the US time frame. And it's let's be respectful to everyone's time. And, you don't have to always have it be in your work day, especially if you want to really bring others along. Be really flexible with your schedule, so it's convenient for all. So those are just some of the things that I do to really ensure that when we're working across global teams, we kind of create a level playing field, knowing that there's always going to be something that happens in the conversation or chat that takes us into a different direction, but just really being mindful of that.
Wonderful. Shilpa, any other examples on how you think we can provide this more of an inclusive and supportive network? You're on mute, Shilpa. Sorry.
Some of the things I would do with my team, one is I would have each team member at different points actually own the agenda and run the meeting. So I wouldn't run every single meeting. I wouldn't start off every meeting. I would actually distribute that task weekly or monthly, depending how often we would have the meetings. The other thing is, so I had a team member who was brilliant, a younger team member, an earlier career professional, who didn't speak in meetings. And my thought was, I'm going to be more intentional about ensuring I'm asking this individual to speak. But then I took a step back and I thought about how this person might view that. And I realized that this person actually might feel like I'm calling them out and take it as a negative because they're not prepared, because they're very shy. And so before the meeting, what I've started to do is before meetings, I'll speak with different people and say, you have some really interesting thoughts on this topic, and I'd love to see you bring this up. And I'm going to ask you in the meeting to talk about this. Are you okay with that? Just to recognize that people may not take, because there's intention and impact. And so my intentions might not actually result in the impact I'm looking for. So I often think about, what is my intention, and will this action get me to the impact I'm hoping for? So that's part of how I've worked to create inclusive teams. I think another thing I've been doing more, and the company I was recently at, I would have a lot of women of color come to me and ask me, how do I use my voice the way you use your voice? And I had to tell them, I also understand that I'm at a place where I can use my voice in a very different way. And I didn't, this one incredible professional African Canadian, and she was feeling guilty that she wasn't using. We were in a meeting, we were with the chief creative officer, another CEO, and speaking, and she was listening, and she said, I'm not able to speak. I feel like I should be speaking out, and I'm not. And I had to tell her that you can't hold all of that as your responsibility. It's also the responsibility of the organization, of your leaders, to create space for you to use your voice. And there also can be consequences of using your voice as well. And so understanding what those consequences are is important as well, because I don't, and perhaps some of you know the stat better, but we are seeing more and more women from diverse backgrounds leaving corporate organizations to create their own create the companies they want to work in, right? And I think that happens because we are not still creating spaces for women of color the way we need to be creating for them. They are highly, when you look at the stats, racialized women, like as Smitha mentioned and Misty mentioned, the work ethic, the drive, the ambition, the ability to navigate different spaces. We have all of the key characteristics and skills and expertise to really be at the very top in the C-suite. So that would, those are some of the thoughts I have. The other thing, kind of pulling on what Misty had said, when I created this council of the agency CEOs, what I learned was they've done the reading, they still weren't sure how to actually make it happen. And I always kind of was in that space of, is this really my work to explain to you how to be a leader in this kind of environment? But then I also realized someone who at their level needed to actually say, this is what you need to do to make the change you're looking for, and to be really specific to them about those changes. And so I think, depending on where you are in your career, figure out how you can use your voice and find the person to support that. With this woman on my team, I understood that for her to use her voice, I needed to ensure that there was a safe environment. And for her, I had to understand what that meant for her. And so understanding, what does safety mean for each of the people on your team, because it's very different for each person. And the other thing, I'm writing an article on leadership and systems leadership versus this sort of hierarchical leadership, because I think the world has to be seen as a system and not as a silo, particularly with the complexity we face. And the other aspect of that is losing my train of thought here, but the other aspect of the idea of leadership for the future is really being consistent with your values, because that's kind of where authenticity comes from. So once your team, you have organizational values, and then those values, hopefully you connect to some of them. Once your team starts to see that consistency, that you make decisions and come back to your values, I think you're starting to create a sense of trust that they know that your decisions aren't ad hoc. They're coming from specific values. And I think for my team, they have that baseline, that decision makes sense because it's connected to this fundamental belief she has and how she wants to move this team forward. And I think that is also important in creating spaces for safe spaces.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Time flew by. We're at the last 5-6 minutes of this, and I want to encourage the audience to also put your questions in the chat. Actually, what Shilpa, what you said is very close to a question that was also posed in the chat. I mean, we're talking about, again, recurring themes is what I'm trying to really learn from this conversation. So we have a blueprint of repeating this, no matter what scale and what industry we're in, right? So being accessible, being intentional, being precise in what you can offer, being precise about what you're looking to get guidance on, they all seem like components of something that we need to put into this new system where we actually get people to get access to more people that look like them or have similar ideas with them, right? And or maybe they share some parts of their journey together to get more, and then have them to push them towards their journey to C-suite. But we also need to think about people who are also newcomers, right? So you can have, when newcomers come to Canada, right, or to the US, it's like you get a reset on your network. You get a reset on, and then you have to align yourself with values, what you just talked about, right? How would you recommend that they go about finding a mentor that can kind of bootstrap their journey? Missy, do you want to go first, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. When I think about mentorship, and then especially the phrasing of kind of resetting the network, I think it is important to really define what you mean by networking and mentorship, because I think that has evolved. And I think a lot of times there is an opportunity to be mentored in a number of different ways. So if you're on, yes, I work for Indeed, but LinkedIn is a great way to actually establish rapport, engage with the content, connect and understand the person, that you may admire from afar. Like, find people that not only look like you. I think that's a good safe space or safe place to start, but find people who are in positions that you aspire to be in. But I also think about what gives you like joy, right? Like, I think during the pandemic, we have all really questioned like the meaning of work and well-being at work. And so really give yourself the space to say, this person is, they're killing it all around, if you will, right? Like, they're an amazing professional and an executive. I like how they show up in the community. And so I think just starting there, I think it's really soft way to like introduce yourself. And then when you're in person, I would just say approach it like you're having a conversation and meeting someone for the first time. Like, I'll be honest, like, I think all of us are really, really busy. So when someone is like, hey, can you mentor me? I'm like, uh-oh, like, that might be a lot, and I don't want to disappoint anyone. And so understand, what can you actually offer to the person, because mentorship is a two-way street. And we are still in positions. I am like a lifelong learner. I'm always learning something new. I get energized. And so also I would say don't glamorize or put folks on a pedestal, because I think that creates anxiety that is unnecessary in an already tough environment. So we are all human, and I would just say, just be confident in your approach, but just approach it as like, I want to get to know you and know some things about what the person is doing, so it doesn't fall flat and it's genuine. And more times than not, especially women will either oblige or will actually open up like all the resources that we have and just give them to you very easily.
Yeah. Smitha, quick 30 seconds. LinkedIn, being specific, what other channels do you think that they can get mentors through?
I think in persons is always great, and I think about it as a two-way street. What you can provide to that person. So if you want them to mentor you, think about, okay, why, I have some thoughts. I was looking at your LinkedIn and, you should be posting more. Or you had such an interesting, giving them something that it feels like a two-way relationship is really important.
Makes sense. Yeah. Shilpa, parting thoughts on mentorship?
Oh, yeah, I think, again, obviously, yes, use LinkedIn, use all the variety of different sources that you have. Be very, very specific. Like I think Misty and Smitha, I hear from a number of really wonderful people about wanting mentorship. And for me to be able to cut through all that, if someone can say, I'd like you to be my mentor. I realize you're not perfect, as Misty said. I am also a lifelong learner. I make lots of mistakes, but I see you do this, and I'd love to know more about this. Or I'd love to know if you could look into this with me. So if the more specific you are, the more likely I can help you.
Perfect. Thank you all so very much for sharing your personal stories and your professional journey. You're all role models. We cannot wait to learn what awaits you. At this point, I'll turn it back to Eva to tell us about what's next.
Wonderful, ladies. Thank you so much for your time, for your advice, for your insights. This has been a wonderful panel, and I'm more than excited to welcome and invite everyone who wants to join us for a 25-minute virtual networking session that will be held on a Zoom meeting with some of our panelists and our guests. You can find the link to join us in the chat, or if you navigate to the second session of our agenda, the link is there as well. So we will be moving over there shortly, and we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you, everyone.